The ballroom at Aldworth House was lit by 400 candles, and not one of them was meant for her. Eleanor stood at the edge of the marble floor, in a gown the color of weak tea, a gown that had been turned twice and let out once, and she watched the man she had married 8 months before bow over the gloved hand of Lady Margaret Carey as though the bow were a vow. The orchestra had begun a quadrille. The room smelled of beeswax and hothouse roses, and the particular cold sweetness of a January night pressing at the terrace doors. She did not move. She had learned, in the months since her father's death, that stillness was the only dignity a poor woman was permitted to keep, and she kept it now the way a person keeps a coat, closed against weather. Across the room, Captain Julian Hartley, lately styled the Earl of Aldworth by the death of an uncle no one had expected him to outlive, lifted his head and looked at nothing. His face was still as ice over a river. He did not look at Eleanor. He had not looked at her once in the hour since she arrived, and the not looking was so deliberate, so carefully maintained, that it had the weight of a hand pressed flat against a door. What the room did not know, what the room would have refused to believe, was that the woman in the tea-colored gown was the Countess of Aldworth, and the man bowing to Lady Margaret was her husband. He had married her in a country church in Hampshire when he was still only Captain Hartley, a younger son with a soldier's pay and a soldier's prospects, and she the daughter of a clergyman with a good name and no money at all. There had been no settlement to speak of and no announcement at all, for they had agreed to wait until his leave was done before they told the world. Then the uncle had died. Then the title had fallen on Julian like a roof, and with it the debts of 3 generations and a dowager aunt who had spent 40 years deciding who was worthy to enter the family she guarded, and Eleanor had watched her husband's face change in the space of a single letter. "Stay in Hampshire," he had written. "Stay until I have set the estate in order. It is not safe yet." She had read the letter 4 times and folded it, and put it in the small wooden box where she kept the things that mattered, and she had stayed. For 6 months she had stayed. And then the invitation to the Aldworth ball had come, addressed not to the Countess, but to Miss Eleanor Pierce, in a hand she did not know, and she had understood that something had been decided about her without her, in the room. If you have ever waited for a door to open, knowing the person on the other side has the key, and has chosen not to use it, then you already know the particular silence Eleanor was standing inside. Stay with her. The door is going to open in a way none of them expect. She had come to London by the public coach, which a countess does not do, and she had spent the last of the housekeeping money on a single night's lodging and the hire of a maid to dress her hair, and she had walked the final half-mile to Aldworth House in shoes worn thin at the heel because she would not waste a shilling on a chair. She had not come to make a scene. She had come because she could no longer bear to be a secret, and because she had begun to suspect that her husband had stopped thinking of her as a wife, and begun thinking of her as a mistake he had not yet found the courage to correct. The dowager, Lady Augusta Hartley, sat enthroned near the orchestra with a fan held precisely half an inch too high, and beside her, arranged like a jewel on velvet, sat Lady Margaret, whose father owned half of Lincolnshire and whose dowry would have cleared the Aldworth debts in an afternoon. The two of them had been watching Julian dance, with the satisfaction of women watching a plan come to fruition. Lady Augusta leaned toward a neighbor and said, in a voice pitched to carry just far enough that it was a mercy the boy had finally seen sense, that one could not run an earldom on sentiment, that the little person from the country had been a passing folly, and nothing more. The little person from the country. The phrase reached Eleanor, across the polished floor, as cleanly as if it had been handed to her on a tray. She felt the words land somewhere beneath her breastbone. Her face did not change. Her hands, inside their mended gloves, drew very slightly together at the seam, and that small movement was the only place in her body where the blow was permitted to show. To understand how she had come to be standing at the edge of a room that belonged to her, you must understand who Eleanor Pierce had been before the world decided who she was. She was the only daughter of the Reverend Thomas Pierce of Compton Magna, a man of small living and large library, who had taught his daughter Latin and Greek, and the names of every bird that came to the rectory hedge, and who had loved her with the whole of his quiet heart until a fever took him in the spring of her 23rd year. Her mother had died when Eleanor was 9. There were no brothers, no uncles with deep pockets, no aunts who wished to take in a grown girl with opinions. There was a rectory that reverted to the next incumbent, a small sum that the funeral and the doctor between them consumed, and a name that in the country still meant something, and in London meant nothing at all. Julian had come to Compton Magna in the last summer of her father's life, sent down from his regiment to recover from a wound taken at sea, and he had walked into the rectory garden looking for nothing, and found her reading aloud to her father under the pear tree. He had stood at the gate longer than a stranger ought, and when her father called him in, he had stayed for 3 hours, and said almost nothing, and Eleanor had thought him the coldest, proudest man she had ever met. She had been wrong about the coldness. She had not yet learned what it concealed. He had come back the next day and the next. He listened more than he spoke. And when he spoke, it was in short, level sentences that gave away nothing and meant everything. He brought her father a rare edition of Virgil that he claimed to have found by accident, and that she later understood he had sent to London for considerable trouble. He learned the names of the birds, the chaffinch, and the yellowhammer and the wren that nested in the ivy by the well, and he learned them not to please her, she thought, but because he was a man who could not bear to be ignorant of a thing once it had been set before him. He carried her father's books for him out to the garden in the warm afternoons and carried them in again at dusk, and he did it without being asked and without remark. And Eleanor, who had spent her life noticing what men did rather than what they said, had noticed. There had been a morning in late September when a thunderstorm caught them in the orchard, and her father had gone in ahead, and Julian had taken off his own coat and held it over her head while the rain came down. In ropes, and the two of them had run laughing for the porch. And at the porch he had not laughed at all. He had stood with the rain dripping from his hair, and looked at her wet face as though he were reading something, written there in a language he had given up hoping to find anyone else who spoke. He had not touched her. He had stood close enough that she could see the rain on his lashes in the place at his temple where an old wound had healed badly, and he had said, in a voice gone rough, that she ought to go in before she took a chill, and the command had been so plainly a thing said in place of another thing, that Eleanor had felt her own face go hot in the cold rain. And one evening, when her father had fallen asleep in his chair and the garden had gone blue with dusk, and the swifts were cutting their last circles against a sky the color of a bruise, he had said, looking not at her, but at the dark shape of the pear tree, that he had not expected to find anything in Hampshire worth staying for, and that he had been mistaken, and that he did not say such things lightly, because he had said them once before to someone and been punished for it. His hands, she remembered, had been very still on the arms of the garden chair, the stillness of a man holding himself in check by force, and a moth had come blundering between them toward the last of the light, and neither of them had moved to brush it away. She had not asked who had punished him. She had learned already that there were doors in him that opened only when they chose to, and that forcing them would close them for good. She had only reached across the small distance between the two chairs and laid her hand over one of his, and felt the breath go out of him, as though she had set down a weight he had been carrying alone for a very long time, and that had been the whole of their courtship, that one unforced touch in a darkening garden, worth more than a season of declarations. They had married quietly in October. Her father, failing by then, had joined their hands in his own church with only the sexton and the sexton's wife for witnesses, and he had wept, and Julian had held her hand so tightly through the vows that she had felt the bones of her fingers shift, as though he were afraid that even now something would reach in and take her from him. 3 weeks later, her father was dead. 6 weeks after that, Julian's uncle died, without warning, in his bed at Aldworth, and the younger son, with a soldier's pay, became the Earl of Aldworth, master of a great house and an entail and a mountain of obligation, and the new countess was left in a Hampshire cottage with a letter telling her to wait. She had waited. She told herself there were reasons. She told herself, a man does not stop loving a woman because a title falls on him, and for a long time she believed it, because she had felt the truth of him in that garden, and a thing felt that deeply does not simply evaporate. Still, the letters had grown shorter. Then they had grown rare. K. The first letters had run to 4 pages and been full of the small, particular things he noticed and saved up to tell her. The state of the roads, a heron he had seen standing in the Aldworth Lake at dawn, the way the great house creaked at night, like a ship. Then they had become a single page, and then half of one, and then they had come once a fortnight instead of twice a week, and the small particular things had gone out of them, and what was left was the dutiful skeleton of a letter, from a man with no time, or a man, she had begun to fear, with no more wish to make the time. Through that long autumn and the winter that followed it, she had kept the cottage on what little there was, mending her own gowns by a single candle to save the tallow, walking to the village herself rather than keeping, teaching the blacksmith's 2 daughters their letters for a few shillings a quarter, so that she need not write to her husband for money. She was not certain he still wished to send. She had grown thin. She had told herself it was the season. She had read her father's last letter on the bad nights, the ones when the wind got into the chimney and the loneliness got into her chest, and she had reminded herself that she was the daughter of a man who had faced a whole life of small living without once growing small himself, and she had set her shoulders and gone on. And then there had been the invitation in the wrong name and a paragraph in a newspaper that a kind neighbor had tried to keep from her and failed, a paragraph that named Lady Margaret as the probable next Countess of Aldworth and congratulated the family on its restored fortunes. The neighbor, an elderly widow named Mrs. Dabney, who had known Eleanor's mother, had come across the green with the folded paper held against her breast, like a thing she did not want to carry, and she had sat in Eleanor's small parlor and held Eleanor's hands, and said that there was surely a mistake, that the papers got everything wrong. And Eleanor had thanked her and given her tea and seen her to the door, and only when the door was shut had she sat down on the cold floor of the passage, with the newspaper open on her knees, and read the paragraph 11 times until the candle guttered. So she had come, not to beg. She had told herself that on the coach, over and over, until the words wore smooth. She had come to look at him once in the face, and to know from his face and not from a newspaper, whether the man who had held her hand so tightly had decided she was a folly he could afford to forget. Now she stood at the edge of the floor, and she looked, and his face told her nothing, and that nothingness was its own kind of answer. The quadrille ended. Julian released Lady Margaret's hand with a bow correct to the inch, and Lady Margaret smiled at him with the confidence of a woman who has been told her entire life that she is the correct choice, and has never once had reason to doubt it. Lady Augusta beckoned them both toward her with 2 fingers, and the little group arranged itself near the orchestra in plain view of the room, and the room, sensing something, began to turn its attention that way. The manner a field of grass turns under a moving wind. A footman passed Eleanor with a tray of wine. She did not take a glass. She had not eaten since the morning, and the smell of the wine made her head swim, but a glass in her hand would shake, and she would not let the room see her hand shake. She set her attention on a single point of candlelight, and she breathed. It was then that the boy found her. He could not have been more than 6 years old, in a small blue coat that matched his uncle's, and he had slipped away from his nurse the way small boys do at large parties, and he came to a stop in front of Eleanor and looked up at her with the frank assessing stare of a child who has not yet learned that some people are meant to be invisible. This was Thomas, the orphaned son of Julian's elder brother, the boy whose existence had made Julian's inheritance so tangled, and whose presence in the house Lady Augusta tolerated as one tolerates a draft. Eleanor did not know any of that yet. She knew only that a child was looking at her as though she were a person, and that it had been a long time since anyone in this room had done so. "You have lost something," she said to him gently, because his small face was working toward tears. "What is it?" "A soldier," he whispered. "A little tin one. Uncle Julian gave it me. And I've lost it, and Aunt Augusta says I am not to cry at a party." "Then we shall not cry," Eleanor said. "We shall look." and she went down on one knee on the cold marble in her tea-colored gown in full view of anyone who cared to look, and she searched the floor along the wall with the boy. The marble was cold even through the gown, and the candlelight lay along the floor in long gold bars, and she ran her gloved fingers into the shadow under the console table where a child's eye would not think to look, and a grown woman's pride would not stoop to, and the boy crouched beside her, with his breath held and his small face fierce with hope. She talked to him while she searched, low and steady, the way she had once talked the blacksmith's frightened younger daughter through her first reading lesson. Where had he last held it? Had he had it on the stair? Had he had it when the music began? And the boy answered each question with the grave seriousness of the very young, and somewhere in the answering he stopped, being afraid. Her gloved fingers closed on a small painted soldier no longer than her thumb. Fallen behind the leg of the console table, its red coat chipped at one shoulder, and its tiny musket bent, she drew it out into the light. She gave it to him. He clutched it to his chest and looked at her with something close to worship, and he said, with the terrible directness of children, that she was kinder than the lady in the blue, who would not stop to look. Eleanor straightened his small collar, which had gone askew in the crouching, and told him that the lady in blue was no doubt afraid of the cold floor, and that he must not think too hardly of people who were afraid, for fear made people unkind without their meaning it. The boy considered this with great seriousness, and decided he would think hardly of her anyway, and Eleanor, against every intention, felt her mouth want to smile for the first time in a day and a night. What none of them knew, what Eleanor herself did not know, was that across the room a man had gone very still. Julian had seen her the moment she entered. He had seen the tea-colored gown, and the worn heels and the careful stillness, and every instinct in him had risen up screaming to cross the room, and he had not crossed it, because to cross it was to ruin her. He had spent 6 weeks building a wall between himself and his own wife, with the deliberate care of a man building a seawall against a tide he could not stop. And the reason for the wall was a thing he had told no one. Now he watched her kneel on the marble to find a child's lost toy, watched his nephew's face open like a window, and he felt the wall he had built begin, very quietly, to crack. He turned away. He made himself turn away. There was a thing he had to do first, and it could not be undone if he did it wrong. Lady Augusta had seen the kneeling too, and her fan stopped moving. She did not know the woman in the brown gown, but she knew the look of a person making herself conspicuous, and she leaned to the woman beside her and said, audibly, that some persons would do anything to be noticed, that the creature had clearly come uninvited, and that she would have a word with the footman about who was permitting climbing women in off the street. The word climbing reached Eleanor as she rose from the floor. She straightened her gown. She did not turn her head. A countess, the dowager, went on, warming to her audience, was a thing made, not born, and certainly not scraped up off a rectory floor in Hampshire. She said it lightly, as a witticism, and several people laughed, and the rectory floor in Hampshire was so exactly the truth that Eleanor felt the breath go out of her as though she had been struck. Stay with me here, because the next quarter of an hour is the whole of why this story is worth telling, and the woman who has been made to feel like nothing is about to discover precisely how much she is worth. Now back to the candlelight and the cold. Julian had crossed half the room to his aunt, and Lady Margaret had risen to meet him, and the orchestra was settling into the first bars of the next set, and the dowager was lifting her chin to make some pronouncement about the evening when her grand-nephew Thomas, still clutching his recovered soldier, tugged at Julian's sleeve and said, one the carrying voice of a child who wants to share good news, that the kind lady had found his soldier, the lady in the brown dress, and would Uncle Julian please thank her, because Aunt Augusta would not. The room heard it. The room always hears the thing it is not meant to hear. Heads turned toward the woman in the tea-colored gown, who stood alone by the console table with her chin level and her hands quiet, and for one long moment no one in the great gold ballroom of Aldworth House spoke at all. Julian looked at his nephew. Then he looked for the first time that evening directly at his wife. And Eleanor, meeting his eyes across the suddenly silent floor, understood three things at once. She understood that he had known she was there from the beginning. She understood that the wall between them had been built on purpose. And she understood, from the way his jaw moved and the way his hand had gone to the breast of his coat, where she would later learn he carried a folded letter he had not been able to make himself burn, that the wall was not contempt. It was something else. She did not yet have a name for it. Lady Augusta, recovering, gave a small laugh and said that the child was overtired and did not know one lady from another, and that someone should take him up to the nursery. She put out a hand to draw Lady Margaret forward, to close the moment over like water over a stone. And it was at that precise instant, with the dowager's hand extended, and the rival stepping forward, and the whole room poised to forget what it had just seen, that Julian Hartley did the thing that no one in the room expected, least of all the woman he had married. Quote, he did not take Lady Margaret's hand. He stepped past it. He crossed the open floor in the silence, 5 strides, while 400 candles burned and the orchestra forgot to play, and every face in the great gold room turned to follow him as a field of grass turns under a moving wind. He stopped in front of Eleanor close enough that she could see the small white line of an old scar at his temple, the one she had first seen with the rain on it in a Hampshire orchard, and he did not bow as a man bows to a stranger. For a moment he only looked at her, and in that moment all the careful nothing went out of his face at once, the way a held breath goes out of a man, and what was underneath it was so plainly written that Eleanor heard, somewhere behind her, a woman draw a sharp breath. He took her bare wrist where the mended glove had slipped and his hand was not quite steady, and he held the wrist the way he had held it at the altar, as though something might reach in and take her, and he turned to face the room with her hand in his. "This is my wife," he said, "the Countess of Aldworth." 5 words and a title. He did not raise his voice. He did not look at his aunt. The words went out into the silence and could not be called back, and Eleanor felt them go through her like the first warmth after cold, almost painful in their suddenness. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the room began very slowly to understand. Lady Margaret went white, then composed herself with the discipline of her training, and stepped back, and in stepping back, she removed herself from the field as cleanly as if she had been asked to. She was not a cruel woman. She had been told she was the correct choice, and she had believed it, and now in the space of 5 words, she understood that she had been arranged like a jewel in a setting that already held another stone, and the recognition that crossed her face was not hatred, but a kind of weary, dawning understanding. She inclined her head to Eleanor very slightly, the courtesy of one woman to another who was one, and she withdrew toward the supper room and did not return. Lady Augusta did not recover so gracefully. Her fan came down. The hand she had extended toward Lady Margaret hung in the air a moment too long, and then she drew it back to her breast as though it had been burned. "Julian," she said, and her voice cracked on the single word in a way that 40 years of perfect control had never permitted before. "You cannot. There has been no settlement. There has been no announcement. This is not how it is done." "It is done," Julian said. "It was done in October, in Hampshire, before her father, who was a better man than any in this room." He paused. His voice did not rise, but it dropped, and the drop was worse. "I let you believe otherwise for 6 weeks because I was a coward, and I have spent every one of those weeks ashamed. I will not spend another." He had not, Eleanor realized, married Lady Margaret to spare himself shame, as the newspaper had implied, and as she had let herself believe. He had been on the very edge of doing exactly that, pressed to it by debt and duty and a dowager who had buried 2 generations of the family and meant to control the 3rd, and he had stood at the lip of that decision for 6 weeks of agony. Yet he had not done it. He had reached the night of the ball, and the woman herself had walked in, and the sight of her on her knees on the cold marble searching for a child's lost toy had shown him, more plainly than any argument, exactly the size of the thing he had almost thrown away. Lady Augusta tried once more. She drew herself up, and she said in the polished hierarchy-protective voice she had used to wound, for 40 years, that a clergyman's daughter without a settlement could not be received, that the family would not survive the debts, that he was sacrificing the name to a sentiment. And here her own grandson, the boy Thomas, still holding his tin soldier, said into the quiet that the brown lady had found his soldier when Aunt Augusta would not even look, and the simple childish justice of it landed in the silent room with more weight than any speech. The dowager had no answer for her child. She looked from the boy to Julian to the woman whose wrist he still held, and something in her face, some long-held certainty, came loose. She was a woman whose script had worked everywhere in every drawing room in England, for the whole of her long life, and it had failed here in her own ballroom, in front of everyone who mattered. And she understood in that moment that it had failed for good. She did not weep. She was far too proud for that. She gathered the rags of her dignity and she said, in a voice gone suddenly old, that she would retire, that she was unwell, and she rose and went from the room leaning on the arm of a footman, and the crowd parted for her and closed behind her, and that was the last the season ever heard of Lady Augusta Hartley's opinion on who was fit to be a countess. Julian turned back to Eleanor. The whole room was watching now, but he had stopped seeing it. He looked at her face, at the chin still level, at the eyes bright with something she would not let fall, and he said low, only for her, that he had carried her father's last letter in his coat for 6 months, and had read it on every day he had been weak enough to consider giving her up, because her father had written in it that he was giving his daughter into the keeping of an honorable man, and Julian had not been able to bear becoming, by his own choice, a liar in a dead man's eyes. "Eleanor," he said. It was the first time he had said her given name aloud in that house, and it fell into the silence like a stone into a still pool. The rings of it went out to the edges of the room. "Forgive me. I lost my nerve. I will not lose it again." She did not make him grovel. That was not in her, and it was not what the moment asked for. She turned her hand within his so that her fingers closed around his fingers, mended glove and bare skin together, and she said, quietly enough that only he could hear it, that she had come all the way from Hampshire on a public coach to find out whether he was still the man from the garden, and that she had her answer, and that they might go home now. The word home undid him in a way. The whole confrontation had not. His composure held, because he was a soldier and an earl, and the room was watching. But Eleanor felt the tremor pass through his hand, and she understood that the cost of the last 6 weeks had not been hers alone. There is a particular quiet that comes over a great room when it has witnessed something true. The orchestra, uncertain, began to play again. The guests, who a quarter of an hour before had been prepared to laugh at a woman in a turned gown, now found reasons to drift near her, to be presented, to discover that they had always thought there was something distinguished in her bearing. Eleanor received them with a grace that gave nothing away and gave nothing back, neither triumph nor reproach. And more than one matron went home that night and told her husband that the new Countess of Aldworth was a woman of rare composure, and meant it as the highest thing she knew how to say. They did not stay long. Julian sent for the carriage, and he put his own coat about her shoulders against the January cold, because hers was thin, and at the door the boy Thomas ran after them in his nightshirt, having escaped his nurse a second time, to press the tin soldier into Eleanor's hand and tell her she might keep it, since she had found it. And Eleanor knelt again in the doorway this time and told him gravely that she would keep it safe, and he might visit it whenever he liked, and that she hoped he would visit it often. Over the child's head, Julian watched his wife, and the thing on his face was no longer ice over a river. The river had broken up. It was only water now moving. The drive back through the dark streets was quiet. Eleanor sat with the tin soldier closed in her gloved hand, and Julian's coat heavy and warm about her shoulders, smelling of him, and Julian sat across from her and did not speak for a long while, and then he reached out in the swaying dark of the carriage and took her hand again, the one without the soldier in it. And he held it against his chest where she could feel his heart going too fast for a man at rest, and he said only her name once more, as though he were still convincing himself she was there. She did not pull her hand away. She turned it so that her palm lay flat against the front of his coat. and beneath her hand she felt the small, stiff rectangle of the folded letter he still carried. Her father's letter, worn soft at the creases from 6 months of being read, and her throat closed. "You kept it," she said. "Every day," he answered. "It was the only thing that kept me honest when everything else was telling me to be otherwise." She had spent the long ride from Hampshire rehearsing all the things she would say to him if she were brave enough. The accusations and the grief, and the long account of what the waiting had cost her. And now, with his heartbeat under her hand and her father's letter under that, she found that she did not need to say any of it. The waiting had ended. The account was closed. What remained was a man holding her hand too tightly in a dark carriage, exactly as he had held it at the altar, and that was the whole of the answer she had crossed half of England to find. They came to Aldworth House by the family entrance, not the great doors, and Julian led her up by a back stair to a small sitting room, with a fire, already lit, a room that had been his mother's, he told her, and that no one had used in years. Someone had put flowers in it. He had ordered it made ready that morning, he admitted, before he had known whether he would have the courage to need it, and the admission cost him something, and Eleanor loved him for the cost. She stood by the fire and let its warmth come into her for the first time in a day and a night, and Julian stood close behind her, not touching, near enough that she could feel the warmth of him along her back, like a second fire. And the not touching was its own kind of speech. The clock on the mantel ticked. A coal settled. The whole house had gone quiet around them. The great machine of it stilled for the night. And in the stillness, Eleanor became aware of her own heartbeat, and of his breathing, and of the precise distance between his hand and her shoulder, a distance of perhaps 2 inches, which neither of them closed, and both of them felt. "I am afraid," he said at last, very low, "that I do not know how to do this gently. I have spent so long holding myself away from you that I have forgotten the way back." "Then do not be gentle," she said, still facing the fire. "Be true. I have had enough of careful men." He turned her by the shoulder, slowly, giving her every moment to refuse, and she did not refuse. And when she faced him, the firelight was on his face, and the old scar at his temple, and the eyes that were no longer ice. And he raised his hand and touched her cheek with the backs of his fingers as though she might prove to be made of something that would break. She turned her face into his hand. That was all. It was everything. His breath went out of him in a way she felt against her own mouth, and he bent his head, and he kissed her. Once, slowly, a kiss that had 8 months of silence stored inside it, and let all of it go, and Eleanor's hand came up and closed in the front of his coat, over her father's letter and her own heart, and she held on. He drew back first, his forehead against hers, both of them unsteady, and he said her name again, and this time it was not a question, and not an apology. It was only her name, said by the one person whose saying of it could remake the whole meaning of her life, and she understood that she had been heard, finally and completely, by the man whose hearing mattered, and that the verdict the great gold room had passed on her was overturned for good. They were married a second time in the spring, openly this time, in the chapel at Aldworth, with the whole county invited and the dowager seated in the second pew, where she had asked, in a stiff brief note, to be allowed to sit. She had not apologized in words. She was too old and too proud to learn that art so late. Yet she had sent the note, and she had come, and she had brought as a wedding gift the great Hartley pearls that had been her own at her wedding 50 years before. And when she put them into Eleanor's hands, her own hands shook, and she said only that a countess ought to have something of her own to wear, and Eleanor, who understood by then exactly what that sentence cost the woman saying it, took the pearls, and thanked her and never once reminded her of the rectory floor. By the following Christmas, there was snow on the Hampshire hills, and snow on the lawns of Aldworth, and Eleanor sat by the long windows of the room that had been Julian's mother's, and was now hers, with the boy Thomas asleep against her side. He had fallen asleep in the middle of asking her whether soldiers felt the cold, his cheek warm against her arm, and the tin soldier still gripped in one fist, and she had not had the heart to move him. The fire had burned down to a steady red glow, and a tray of half-drunk chocolate sat cooling on the low table. And somewhere below in the great house a servant was singing very quietly over some late task, an old tune Eleanor half remembered from her father's church. She watched the white come down out of the dark sky and settle on the world, on the bare lime walk and the stone urns, and the long sweep of the drive she had once walked up in worn shoes. And she thought, without bitterness now, of the woman who had stood at the edge of a bright room. On the windowsill beside her, where she had sat it that first night and never moved it, stood the small painted tin soldier no longer than her thumb, its red coat chipped at the shoulder, its tiny musket bent, keeping its watch over the snow. Julian came in quietly from the cold, snow still on the shoulders of his coat and in his dark hair, having ridden the last of the tenants' Christmas boxes around the estate himself, because he said a man ought to know the faces of the people who depended on him. He stood behind her chair and looked for a long moment at the sleeping child and the watching woman and the little soldier on the sill. And then he put his hand on her shoulder, and this time he closed the distance without hesitating, and bent and pressed his cold mouth to the warm crown of her head. She reached up without looking, and laid her hand over his. The fire burned, the snow fell. The little tin soldier kept his watch on the windowsill, and the house that had once tried to keep her out had become, in the plainest and truest sense of the word, her home. If Eleanor's journey moved you, stay a moment in the quiet she finally earned, and if you have ever waited for a door to open, I hope yours opens too. Thank you for staying until the end.